However powerful these dialogues were at a local level, it was not evident that we were having a significant impact in the larger world of human affairs. We could not do more work than we were doing ourselves. We needed to work with, through, perhaps for others to realize the potential we discovered. This thinking coalesced into the idea of starting an international body for professional dialogue.
Hello and welcome to A New Kind of Dialogue, the podcast. I'm Jane Ball, co-founder of Dialogue Associates, along with Peter Garrett. In this podcast, we aim to bring the concept of dialogue into your life and the way you work. And we're doing this by exploring the chapters of Peter's book, A New Kind of Dialogue. This is the final episode in the series, but the story continues. Please let us know what you'd like to hear us do next on the podcast. Later in this episode, we'll hear from Thomas Kottner in Argentina. Thomas is an experienced executive coach who works online with clients from across the globe and is also now a trustee of the Academy of Professional Dialogue. But before that, we tackle the final two chapters of the book, and we'll end by reflecting on the lessons we've learnt throughout the conversations that have brought us to this point, and invite you to do the same. So, Peter, chapter 25 is titled Affecting the Field. Could you explain the title to our listeners?
It's part of a phase of a natural development. I, a few years back, looked at a variety of jobs I've taken on over the years and realized how I developed myself in those jobs. So the first part of it was what I called realizing yourself. In other words, what is this job and how does it work and what's going on? So I wouldn't just going into a new job and changing everything straight away to realize what's involved. And the same when you hear about dialogue, what is it? And read about it, think about it, ask people, find out about it. Second phase, in my experience, was showing up. Showing up doesn't mean turning up, it means getting onto the stage. Everybody can see you having a try at whatever this new job is. Sometimes I was very confident, sometimes I wasn't, sometimes I did well or badly, but the big difference was everybody could see me and give me feedback, and that's a bit more vulnerable than realizing yourself, showing up. Easier when you're younger, actually. And then as you get pretty confident in it, it's occupying the ground. You're grounded in your understanding, you know what you're doing, you're comfortable and confident. In fact, if you get your balance well, you're quite happy taking on new challenges where you don't know what to do, but you've got a good idea, you'll work it out. And that's a great time in a particular role, is occupying the ground and knowing what you're doing. What I noticed then later is what I call affecting the field, which this chapter is, where beyond the work you're doing, other people hear about it. You've not communicated with them directly, but they've heard from other people, and they start to pick up what you're doing and try it for themselves. And that affecting the field is a much broader area. You don't do well with affecting the field if you insist things have to be done the way you do them. In other words, the requirement for an orthodox approach that follows exactly what I did does interfere with affecting the field. It's a far broader thing. And that's why I've written from personal experience rather than defining do this, don't do that kind of approach. So affecting the field, we're at that part of the book where I think I and you with me have occupied a ground with professional dialogue work, and now we're looking to go much wider and affect the field.
The chapter goes on to describe the process to establish the Academy of Professional Dialogue. What, in your view, why was it important to establish a profession rather than just a dialogue network or some such kind of organisation to spread dialogue work?
Well, the question was really how much influence can we have? I don't think you can work with more than 2 or 3 serious clients at any time. And you can count the years where one might work in one's career. So we could pretty well work out how many more clients we could take on in our own business. So it's quite a limited impact. So the big thing about setting up an academy is to go much, much wider, to broaden the work and help other people to do it and spread the thing. Why a profession? Well, I always felt like a professional person. I think professional people do what they say they'll do. They understand how to do what they're doing, and they have integrity and honesty and are professional in their approach and so on. What I lacked was a professional body to join. So I thought, well, if we don't have a professional body, we should have, because I know other people who see themselves as professional. So we formed the Academy of Professional Dialogue.
What year was this?
You got me there.
I know, me too. I was thinking, what year is that?
I would say it was 7 years ago. We're now 2023. So
2016.
2016.
The Academy was also established as a not-for-profit charity, as well as a profession. Why a not-for-profit charity?
Right. Had we gone for a profit-making business, we would have really been saying we want to build a larger consultancy and educating company. Whereas as a not-for-profit, the interest is the benefit of society rather than the benefit of individuals. So society, in my view, needs dialogue. The world needs dialogue was the title we gave to the conferences. It's needed broadly in society. So as a non-profit organisation, it makes clear that's the beneficiary. It's not that members of the Academy shouldn't themselves make money, make good money, but the aim of the Academy is to benefit society.
In establishing the Academy, we were bringing together people from different countries and in a way from different schools of dialogue, some of them. Mm-hmm. What was that process like?
Great fun.
What was it really like? What's involved in doing that? Trying to create, in some ways, it seems like creating a broad church by doing that, but also trying to stay clear on what professional dialogue is really about.
I felt I had one advantage, was having been around since the beginning of the dialogue approach that we're taking. In other words, from the beginning with David Bohm, after 3 or 4 decades, I had travelled a journey and seen a lot of, and participated in a lot of what other people had done. So my own perspective was that every approach has a contribution to make and has a place. The question is more, what's the scope of it? How wide is it? I felt where some had a disadvantage was that they had learnt one particular kind of group work or whatever and saw that as the whole picture. So it was quite a challenge early on, saying how do we define a curriculum, given we're an educational charity and want to make learning available to people? How do we determine a curriculum with a lot of people, all of whom think they have the whole answer, to some degree, including me, although I hold that more lightly, I think. But that was a challenge, a bit like herding cats in a way.
Yeah, I think it's true that because of the connection you had personally, firsthand, as we've heard in this podcast, with David Bohm, I think in some ways you were uniquely placed to be able to create an organisation such as this. I think it would have been more difficult for other people. It would have been more difficult, despite my years of work, more difficult for me to do it.
I believe so, and we deliberately set up the Academy based on the ontology of David Bohm. By ontology, I mean his thinking about the implicate order, how things unfold and are unfolded back, and they derive from that the idea of pervasive fragmentation in human consciousness. And that's the root of the dialogue work. People talk about others who are strongly involved in group work and dialogue work, but take Martin Buber or somebody, not based on the same ontology. So we anchored it deliberately into the ontology of the Academy, and it served us well, I think.
Mm-hmm. So what is the Academy? What does the Academy do? What's the activity within the Academy?
So it's an educational charity, and the first thing we did was to gather people to form the Academy. Then what we did is we decided to have a first conference. I recall you, Jane. I wanted to do the conference in 6 months. You went for 18 months, which proved a bit wiser. But we had our first conference, 80 people altogether, and very exciting beginning, actually. And we've kept a conference every year. So every year there's an annual conference gathering people who are working with professional dialogue. And also we made a point of recording and publishing material. So every year we produced a book based on the conference. The first conference, the theme was Gathering the Field. And there's a good, solid hardback book describing the work of the participants, and that's continued every year. We also immediately, at the time of the first conference, set up the Professional Standards and Accreditation Board. And our idea was to create a curriculum which was commonly accepted as a way of developing practitioners and organizations with dialogue. And that curriculum it was approved by the PSAB and is now in place for dialogue in the room. We created a further level dialogic intervention and a third level, which is systemic dialogue. They came out of long conversations, but they do echo in a way the development I experienced over the years, and I've seen some others have as well. Mm-hmm.
Why is accreditation important for the Academy?
Well, we had a good number of people practicing dialogue, all of whom could put a sign up outside their offices saying dialogue practitioner for 20 years or whatever, who had varying levels of skill and ability. So we thought it would be a good move to introduce a form of accreditation to say people do have the basic skills to be able to do what they say they're going to do. As an aside, my dentist, Greg Gussain, South African Lebanese guy, a good friend, said to me, that's a very good move. I thought, well, you're not really a dialogue practitioner. Why do you think it's a good move? He said, well, in dentistry, before we had accreditation, you got good dentists and bad dentists. You took your luck. But he said, once we introduced accreditation, everybody's skill went up. It wasn't the common view of people in the Academy that accreditation was necessarily a good idea. There were quite a few who thought it would kill the spontaneity of the dialogue work, but plenty who thought it would be valuable, and I believe that's proven to be the case.
Certainly sounds like a very different way in which people can step into dialogue work than what we heard from you, from your experience meeting David Bowman, developing things there, and then finding Patrick Damari and talking to him and gradually. This is something that people can step into that gives them a way of learning.
Absolutely. It's still not real until you do it yourself, of course. I was thinking back to my sunroof days when fit a sunroof. Well, you cut a hole in the roof of the car here, and I'm with my fitter, brand new car, he cuts a hole in the roof of the car. Dennis, that hole's in the wrong place. In a brand new car, and the owner's outside. What am I going to do? So it's one thing saying, well, we've got a curriculum. You've got to do it. How do you do it when you have organizational conflict and tensions, and there's not a script in the curriculum say, well, if it's this and this, you do that. You have to make it real. So the curriculum is one thing, but understanding what you can do and how it can be done is a great help. It really is.
Maybe we'll come back to that in a minute, the relationship between the book and what can be seen there and a curriculum and first-hand learning, which I know has been the thread through these 400 and something pages. But one of the things that we did within the Academy in the early days was try and write down a definition of what dialogue is. We've heard it described in many different ways through this podcast.
That was part of a consultation to initially make some definition and then start to get some basic curriculum. And there were a lot of different views there.
But I thought it might be worth just reading out some of those, that paragraph, and break it down. Because I think when people hear the words, they'll see how it ties back very clearly to the first-hand journey that we've been describing. So if you would indulge me, okay. It says, dialogue is a skillful way of talking and thinking together that establishes a flow of common meaning and feeling amongst a group of people. The spirit of dialogue is to understand rather than to convince, and the process changes the ground out of which the various relationships arise.
Quite a lot in those two sentences, but they certainly reflect my early experience in the dialogues we arranged with David Bohm. There was no endeavour to persuade people to think anything. What do you really think? What is it you're trying to say that I'm not getting? I understand my thinking, but I need to understand yours. So there's definitely that. It also echoed very strongly in the early prison dialogues at Whitemoor. The series ran for 9 years. They began with very different understandings, but gradually became skillful talking together. I described how one prisoner, when he was released, was interviewed on radio, and very skillful communicator by that time. And then this feeling of what Patrick Demare picked up from the Greek term koinonia. Koinonia is a feeling of impersonal fellowship. You belong with others even though you don't know them personally. Religiously, you call it communion. You could more openly call it citizenship. As a citizen, you have certain things that you can do, and I support, even though I don't agree with you, I support your freedom of speech to have your own opinion and so on. So yeah, the stories, if you read the book and follow thoughtfully, I think that's self-evident, those statements.
I do. Let me tell you the next two. Professional dialogue is a transparent way of learning together and humanising an organisational community. Through professional dialogue, organisations and communities are able to engage the collective intelligence of the participants to make better decisions and to realise the creative opportunities inherent in any problem.
Right. Again, a lot in those two sentences. But this, I think you'll find quite strongly in the stories of intervention work, where we've gathered people and started to, koinonia is a feeling between people. Humanizing an organization is a step well beyond that. So you might recall the meetings I described with Tufan and others, meeting for a week every month. The fellowship that emerged, the humanizing of his whole organization was remarkable. But the collective intelligence, some people say it doesn't matter how good your decisions are, you can make any decision work. It's to let the boss say what he wants and we'll make it work. But it wasn't that, it was actually using the collective intelligence. Is that the best way, or do you have another idea? And the contributions made far better decisions. So that's definitely a good encapsulation of the intervention work in many, many different organisations.
And I think the transparency in the first sentence you described with the union and management together, putting your cards on the tables so everybody could see them, not keeping them close to your chest. And then I think in Trinidad, the planning process that meant everybody could see every plan owned by every part of the organisation. Again, that wasn't kept hidden.
Mm-hmm. It's making the circle bigger, because otherwise I hide my cards, or my group, the union, hide our cards to get advantage. But when you are interested in advantage of the whole, so a lot of people's jobs depend on it and so on. The transparency is essential. Yep.
And then the final two sentences, the reliable practice of professional dialogue at a systemic level generates sustainable, strategic and operational change. In a dialogic organisation or a dialogic community that's underwritten by the ongoing regeneration of its culture, including shifting historically stuck patterns of behaviour for the constructive benefit of the whole.
So this is a step deeper into systemic work, isn't it? Where the aim is to take the practice of dialogue across the larger organisation, and that requires a whole further set of considerations. But what it does is it gets at the culture. The culture is the way we do stuff. When you try this, well, that's not how you do it here. You try it differently. Now I know why you don't do it here. But how do you shift the culture? Well, it's a kind of reservoir of stuck feelings, emotions, thoughts, incidents. It takes a bit of work to shift that culture. So the systemic work can do that. It requires clarity about strategy, requires engaging people, not trying to remove history, but trying to incorporate history. Exclusion doesn't lead to a clear culture. It's inclusion that's required. Requires acknowledgement, respect, and so those two sentences, I think you'll find again, probably particularly in the story about Virginia Department of Corrections, you can see the many steps involved in business practice and strategy, and developmentally how the organization changed quite deeply from command and control to people together being interested in helping people change to their benefit, staff and prisoners and those under supervision.
And the Virginia Department of Corrections was accredited as the first dialogic organisation by the Academy as well.
And they got, 12,000 staff of that order, 30,000 people incarcerated, 70,000 people under supervision in the community, operating in a dialogic manner, is starting to get to scale.
So it was helpful to read those sentences out because they encapsulate everything about this work in a dense way, but also that definition is tied back very clearly to the stories that we've been exploring in this podcast that you explore in your book. Otherwise, you can see something, you think, oh, that sounds like a very good idea, but I've no idea where it came from. Well, people will know.
So you could, from the stories, find that to be self-evident. It could be an aid memoir to say, oh, your transparency, I need to think a bit more about that. And it could also be the basis of a curriculum. If the curriculum contradicts that, we need to stop and think about it.
To move on to the final chapter of the book, appropriately titled The Time Has Come.
Right.
It sounded like you struggled to know when to stop writing. Things kept developing and changing, and things have already happened within the Academy and your work and our work since you finished writing the book. One of the things I'd like to raise that you explore in that is back to the beginning, where you were talking in the preamble about first-hand learning and second-hand learning and third-hand learning. How do you kind of reconcile those things in what the book is offering people?
So it's fundamental to the learning process. It's not only describing experiences in childhood, in work, in my career, with other people, but it's also making some sense of them in a useful way. First-hand experience is your own experience. And if you don't remember and understand how to take advantage of it, you remain either a victim to the misfortune or a not very conscious beneficiary of good fortune. So there's something about understanding the first-hand experience, and you can have real misfortune and it can be the making of you, of your character, of your strength, your resilience, your future, or you can be forever whining about it. So the thing about first-hand experience is not only may you be able to recall it. I say, what's the first memory you have? Okay, I got my first memory. You got your first memory. A listener could say, what's your first memory? There's something about that first memory. Well, I've heard my parents talk about it so much. I don't know if it's first-hand or not. If it's first-hand, you will remember what the smells were like, what the light was like, what the sound was like. So I remember being in a little shop in Mozambique at about 7 years old. I remember the smell of the soap and the oil and the prawns and the beer mixture and the sea outside, salted fish drying. So it's a sensory thing as well. There's a depth. When you reflect on first-hand experience, you can learn things you haven't realized before. Like I realized not only did my father like to go and have prawns and a beer in the morning, he also was learning Portuguese. How do I know? Because the guy, I remember him talking Portuguese. I remember the kind of social interaction and so on. Secondhand is not like that. I remember well, for example, David Bohm telling me about Einstein and Bohr at a kind of cocktail-like party. They went to either ends of the room. They didn't agree, and they and their partners separated and didn't want to communicate. Now, I remember that clear as a bell. How big was that room? Actually, no idea. Was it daytime or nighttime? I have no idea. Was it a cocktail party? I think it was, but do scientists like that go to cocktail parties? I don't know. So what do I get? I get the meaning. Well, that meaning is an interpretation, whereas the first hand is open to a deeper understanding and further interpretation. Second hand, by the time it's third hand, I was talking to somebody the other day, I've got a model like that. It's got 6 parts. This and this. Actually, I can't remember the fifth one. I don't know the sixth one. Why? Because it's quite remote from experience. So the distinguishing between what's first hand, what's second hand, and what's third hand is the fundamental. In the book, the intervention worker is all about third hand experience. You go to a business and people will tell you what the CEO's like. They'll tell you what the union's like. Did you ever meet the CEO? No, never met him in my life. How do you know all these things? Oh, people tell me. No? It's all third hand, of course. And once you get people in the room together for first-hand experience, lo and behold, an awful lot of stuff dissolves. People come to a common understanding quite easily. So knowing that third hand is third hand and an interpretation is a big piece. Knowing second hand is useful if you make use of it and understand how to turn it into something real. And knowing your first-hand experiences define your caliber, your character, your vision, your scope, and so on. So these are pretty basic stuff. What do I think of social media? I think it's third, fourth hand. Who knows where it came from? Increasingly, we're told, well, actually, it's deliberately not true or whatever. So can you ignore it? You can't. You have to take it into account, but you have to be really clear what is the case in your experience and what isn't. The world is slightly different from the way media presents the world, in my experience, and I think for others if they look closely.
Yeah. Say a little bit more about the need for dialogue now. The questions about fragmentation we've talked about before over the years, but now you're raising social media. There are many things changing in the world. What would you say about the current kind of quality of our society and our world and the call for more dialogue?
Well, the challenge we have is partly fragmentation. Fragmentation in consciousness means, you might recall the very beginning of the story I described being a child and listening to my parents and friends talking and falling asleep and thinking, well, the people who are most intelligent and capable are thinking about the well-being of the situation, and I trust them and I'm comfortable. And I described the shock of realizing in the world, in government and the United Nations, wherever it is, that isn't happening. We don't all look to the most intelligent and capable people to guide us. In fact, people are looking out of self-interest. Now, that fragmentation, it takes the form, if you look, for example, artificial intelligence. Is artificial intelligence developing for the well-being of society? Probably in academia it is. Probably academics are looking at how artificial intelligence will benefit society with many challenges we've got. Probably commercially and in business, it is not. It's probably driven by gain and making sure I'm not left out of making money and benefit and power and position out of this. But the fragmentation in that case is between academia and commercial activity. When they come together, they do fabulously, but when they're separated, there are problems. And then within that, we've got businesses competing, and of course the key thing we've named is organizations. Organizations are a smaller circle that work for their own benefit, and that's where decisions are made. And then we come down to the fact that we're not running those organizations, they're kind of running us. You have to wait for the decision from the organization to be able to move forward what you're trying to do, if you can. So it's very widespread. The idea the world needs dialogue is based on fragmentation in organizations is hard to dispute. Yeah.
I wonder if this would be a good time to hear Thomas's question. Thomas from Argentina is our guest for today.
Now, Peter, when the intention is to generate change in the whole system, what do you do to handle the time restrictions in an always in a hurry corporate environment? Do you do partial interventions? Do you choose smaller systems than the whole? How do you do that?
Well, interesting question, Thomas. My experience of working with organizations is they are speeding up and wanting to do things faster, have things completed faster, and that leaves a challenge to the quality of work, to be honest. Where the dialogue is important is where there are a number of different stakeholders who affect each other. So doing one's own bit in a speedy way doesn't necessarily help the whole to move forward more quickly. So where you're interlinked with others, the question is, how do you deal with that? And there the dialogue is necessary. I have two things there. One is the skill level. People, when they become skilled, can work dialogically very quickly and very efficiently, can have a short gathering and get clarity and move on. When people don't have skill, it seems like hard work. I remember, Jane, you and I once did a program, I think we called it Big Leap, was it?
Oh, yes.
Where we had people who were dealing with multi-stakeholder change initiatives. We ran through the sequence of steps needed. They were, man, this is going to take forever. At the end, they said, this is obvious and simple and straightforward. So when you've got the skill, like learning to drive a car, you can go along fine. So the other part of the question seems to relate to you're trying to work with the whole system, but do you come down to smaller parts of it? So that's a question of, I want to change the whole organization. I've not got a lot of time. What do you do about it? I don't recall many people coming to me and saying, I'd like to change my whole multinational organization, or even my small organization. It's rare that you start that way. You usually start with a pressing, shorter-term problem that has to be tackled. And you do it in a dialogic way where people say, wow. And that now, if we did that in some other areas, this would be a different situation. And you gradually incorporate the existing initiatives into an overall systemic approach. So you don't ignore what's happening as much as incorporate it. So yes, you do start with smaller pieces, definitely, and well-defined pieces. This is what's not going to work unless we do something. Can you help?
Good, thank you.
So what's it been like being an interviewer? Because normally we're talking together rather than being interviewed. It's been a bit one-sided.
It's been hard work. It is hard work. Each time we've headed home, I felt exhausted because what I'm trying to do is give all of my attention to you, to listen to the story that you're telling. Meanwhile, in my own mind, you talk about your first day at school. I'm thinking about my first day at school, my first job, or even some of the work that we've done together. So my own memories are being triggered. And normally if we were sitting over coffee or in the office or in a car, I'd go that way and I'd say, oh, well, yes, at my first day at school. But the discipline to not do that, to know it's there and think, well, that's interesting. I could think about that tonight. But to stick with you, I think has been the hard work of it. I mean, it's good. It's not that I'm not interested in but going with it. But it shows this kind of discipline that's required for really good listening. And then the other thing, of course, is some of the stories you were telling, I was thinking, kind of wanting to question them a bit more or wondering about them, because you told some quite contentious things. I mean, you talked about your childhood in Zimbabwe, which was called Rhodesia at the time. You talk about having servants and moving between the kind of servant's house and your parents' house. And some of that, I kind of wanted to press a little bit on it. And again, just thought that maybe on another occasion, another podcast to explore that.
Yep.
And I was thinking, well, how interesting it would have been if one of the servants was here in the dialogues. What was their experience? They were in two houses, in their house and your parents' house. What was that like for them? What was their experience of that? So just being really attentive to this is it's what I'd call the quality and the practice of respect, that this is about your story and really unfolding that, not to put the brakes or push it in one direction or another because of what interested me.
It does bring out something that's the heart of the book, though, isn't it? Is there's following what's happening outside, and then there's what's going on inside in your own thinking and feeling and impulses and memories and so on. I think to do dialogue work, you have to track both.
Yeah.
If you're not aware you have an inner conversation, you can't get into dialogue work.
Yeah.
If you get carried away by your inner conversation, you stop listening and you're lost, you can't get into dialogue work. So there's something about how do you work those two together?
And how do you at times bring it in? So recording a podcast, there's particular rules in a way. And there were times maybe towards an end of an episode where I could bring it in. And in a dialogue, it would be different because there's 10 of you in a dialogue. I would say probably 9/10 of the time you're more likely to be listening. But when do you speak up? When does the story that you're tracking in your own mind come out? When is it a contribution rather than an indulgence? And so being aware of both and then having a sense of the timing of when it's going to add, I think, is really important.
And timing, as you say, and it might be a contribution or an indulgence, but there's times I now believe I should have spoken when I didn't. And finding what it was that held me back. And times when I have spoken when I think I shouldn't have, and finding what led me to do that. That's getting towards the work one does internally, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, you find some people will never talk about their own first-hand experience. And everything's generalized. Why is that? What's happening? You know?
I really don't know. I mean, the other thing I've experienced recently, actually in part through thinking more about my reaction to stories in your book, either through my own story or whatever, is that it's also that changes. So, you know, reflecting on why I have or haven't spoken up. At the time, I may have had one story about it. And then later on, I find I have a different story.
Yeah.
And then as I explore something, maybe years later, I find a different story about it. And they're all true, but it's a deepening understanding of what's going on for oneself. But you were raising the question about why people don't tell their personal stories, or the kind of little devil on my shoulder saying, well, maybe because they don't have any, you know, because I'm trying to give a facade that I'm this expert and I know these things. And so I'll tell you a intellectual narrative. I don't really have a personal story behind it to share. So I do think that happens. And some of that, I think, is driven socially, where people feel like they have to show up in a particular way. And of course, that social pressure would be another reason why they don't bring things out. You wouldn't. I had a client once, and he had a screensaver, had a photograph of his granddaughter. Now, in the leadership team of which he was part, people didn't talk about their personal life. And for him, this was a massive victory that they'd all be sitting with their laptops open, and his, when it went into sleep mode or whatever, had a photograph of his granddaughter. And it seems such a little thing, but for him, that was a massive step forward, just to, in that environment, be able to bring it out.
Well, just listening to you, I'm thinking maybe I should write an autobiography, because it would be very interesting to take the time to think what has shaped my own experience and why do I attach importance to some things and other things. In the book, I just tried to find stories that would lead to an understanding of the dialogue work. But it would be interesting to go that way, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe people talk secondhand. And if you're talking secondhand, it's very hard to find stories that substantiate secondhand knowledge in the book kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
To quote the authority rather than bringing out their own experience, I guess.
Yes. I know. I was thinking that for myself, I have this is all the stories I've been squashing inside my head and not bringing out as we've been recording these podcast episodes. I'm now having the opportunity. They're coming tumbling out one after another. But yeah, I was thinking about my relationship with my brother, who may listen to this podcast. But he's 2 years older than me, like super, super smart. Always the big brother to look up to. But
that sounds like a compliment and a suffered compliment, if I might.
Yeah, well, I thought I should start with the compliment in case he listens.
Yeah.
But no, I love him very much, genuinely. But he was always the kind of expert, clever child. And, I think, though there were times when for me I suffered that, I think what I've discovered in my life is that actually that has given me a great gift, which is I'm the more straight talking. I don't talk in an intellectual way, I don't believe. I try not to. And I try to talk people in really simple level language in which they can understand things. And I think in the story you've been telling about our work, some of the influence that I've had on the development of dialogue, like you don't have to have studied dialogue for many years to be a dialogue practitioner. You just start. Look at where you are, notice what's happening, see how you can start there. I think comes from that being the younger sister, the less intellectual one, who just kind of got on with things and was actually started to enjoy that position rather than wishing I was cleverer.
The less intellectual, you probably never got to university, did you?
Yes, I know, it's stupid, isn't it? Anyway.
How many degrees do you have?
Just a couple. But that's the thing, isn't it? It's the kind of deeper narrative in one's life.
And the thing is knowing that, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's you have to be somebody, and I have the advantage or disadvantage of being confident.
Yeah.
Because I grew up in a situation that led me to be confident. Well, it opened lots of doors, but being aware of that is a question. No?
Yeah, and in some ways, I think this is an important aspect of the personal kind of inner work as a dialogue practitioner, to know that in yourself. And so we were saying a bit earlier in this episode, like, where do people start? You can just start by those inner inquiries, can't you?
So a bit of it is understanding yourself. Remembering is not understanding. Remember is recall. It's reflecting on that to understand, that's why I'm like I am. That's why my impulses are the way they are, or why I'm concerned and interested. There's a bit of that. There's a bit of what we've just been talking about, the inner conversation and why it's like it is, and the outer conversation, why it's like it is. The observer and the observed are one kind of thing. And there's something else to take into account, is coming from the perspective of the whole. People tend to be much more interested in their own world and their own needs and requirements. It's quite a job to expand that outward. So I think if I were listening to this podcast and wondering, I'd be thinking, those are kind of interesting perspectives, but how do you do all that? And what do you need? I mean, what would you say to people who are listening?
I would say to take that principle, particularly of thinking from the perspective of the whole, as you're doing your close-up work, And I know I mentioned before, and I know not every woman or not every person has a child, but when you have a child, I think you think about the world and the state of the world. You think about the future, because they start to represent the future. Because until you have a child, you're just looking at yourself as the youngest generation in your family, and everybody else is older, so I'll be here when they're gone. So now you start to think about the future. So I think thinking long term, thinking about the whole, and acting with whatever's in front of you. And I find people are really hankering for something different. And I think I'd say have a really close look at dialogue, because you may find that this is the something different that is within your grasp. But I do think that the inclusion of the other is a really important part of what's different about that work. So think about them and include them in what you're doing, and really include them.
One other reflection I had, you see the image on the book.
Mm-hmm.
It's people sitting in a circle talking, if you like. It's like a dialogue. But you see the one side is embodied in the other.
Yes.
There's a pink there, but there's a green there as well. It's kind of like we're within each other socially, if you like. But what I was thinking about was, if you're starting dialogue work, it's the same all the time, but from the beginning, draw a small circle. Like maybe the circle is just your team. How does the team work? What are the norms? How does it work well? How doesn't it? What would happen if you were more transparent and more open? And try it. Start to pick up some of the skills, some of the practice and so on. But then there's a concentric circle beyond that team. What if you made the circle a bit bigger and included people around them, the others from the other department that didn't reply, or the other group that keep insisting on this or whatever? And my experience is, if you draw a circle and work out within that circle and keep drawing larger circles, in the end you get not only departments. I mean, we tried it, didn't we? You get to whole prisons, you get to whole systems, you get to large organizations.
Yeah. But
you don't catapult over there. It's a generative process, I think.
Yeah, I know. I think it's true. It's also slightly entrepreneurial in my experience. I mean, sometimes it doesn't have to be, as in the stories that you've described. You've kind of got the clear sponsorship of somebody who says, oh, yes, we're going to take this process forward in this way. But I found much of my work has had to be a bit entrepreneurial as well. So you get so far within the scope of your client, and they can maybe invite another circle in, but then it gets to the kind of limit of their authority to invite other people in some way. Then there's a new initiative from the chief exec, or a new law, or a new policy, and people are wondering about that. So then you say, okay, well, if you thought about that in a dialogic way, though I wouldn't necessarily use that language, who would need to be in that conversation? Okay, well, why don't we invite them in? So that's what I mean by entrepreneurial. There will be challenges and requirements that come up that you can then start to add in, and with those, it draws in another group of people.
Another one is treating people as peers. I know I've worked with a range of people before I had a chance to work with you, some of whom could not work with more senior people.
Yeah.
They assumed senior people were different, and they performed in front of senior people or kept quiet or told them what they wanted to hear. They didn't tend to interact with them as another person. But also with more junior people, they tend to be a bit superior, arrogant, not very interested. But the knowledge of what's happening is all the way up and all the way down. It's no easier at the top than the bottom. It's everywhere. Yeah. So that's a big part of it, I think, isn't it?
I think it really is.
That's the interesting part of it.
I was going to say, and that's why, when we talk about developing skills, I've always just been like really interested in people, really interested. And so that's the kind of what drives me, like whoever I can get to talk to, you do so. Now I know that it's really good to treat everybody as a peer, but really I just started out by being really interested in what everybody had to say and by their perspective. It's fun.
Well, before I got to university, I took a job in an architect's office. I was drafting. And then I went to university, studied architecture. I thought, well, maybe I'll become an architect. And if I hadn't done what I've done now, I think I would have become an architect. And I built houses and so on. But my reflection now is I am an architect, but an architect in consciousness rather than an architect in building homes. A big one. Do you think we could change the world through dialogue?
Yes.
Why do you say that?
Well, people who have read the book will know in the foreword I describe our first meeting. And at the time I was working in criminal justice, running a drug treatment team. And you know this, but so I'm telling our listeners. And I said that I really wanted to change the criminal justice system. And you said to me, well, I want to change the world. I thought, okay, I'll join in.
Well, let me answer my own question as well. I believe we can, because I believe there's only one problem. If the one problem is fragmentation in consciousness, and if we learn how to deal with that, that is occurring in every organization around the world, be it a university or a commercial business or a prison or whatever. Now, I had one vivid example of how that might happen, I'll tell you. I was working in Aberdeen in Scotland, and we had 400 people in the meeting, and I was facilitating this meeting. As they arrived, we gave each person a playing card from a pack. They're roughly 50 cards in a pack with 400 people. There were 8 of each card around in the room. So these 400 people, everybody had one playing card, the 6 of diamonds or whatever. So then I said, okay, now we have a competition. In the room, there are 400 people. Amongst all those people in the room, 7 other people have exactly the same card as you. Who can be the first to get all 8 together? When you got all 8 together, stand together, raise your hand. And the room went into complete chaos. Some were bidding, some were shouting, some were quiet, they all over. And it eventually, it all came out, and there they were, 50 different groups, each with 8 of them. Now, it sounds a bit of a funny metaphor, but that's what could happen if we started to change in every organization. We've got to accommodate each other. The whole pack could sort itself out.
Yeah, I agree.
So we're an acorn at this stage, but don't dismiss the idea.
Yeah. I remember reflecting with Steve Holland, who you mentioned in the book, in the podcast, when he was the governor at the prison that we transformed so quickly from being the worst performing prison of its type in the country to the best. I mean, over a ridiculous period of time, like 18 months, it was madness.
Over months.
And it was very similar. Nobody would have ever projected that you could do that. If you'd written a Gantt chart with all your kind of milestones and kind of activity plans, and it just wouldn't have happened. But what we did with him was unleash that energy so that people within the overall kind of, bounds of what they had to do were able to use their own initiative and drive things forward. Absolutely. And there were amazing things that happened. So many things happened there that everyone said, there's no way you can do that. They put a fish tank in the centre in the prison where all the prisoners walked past every day, all the guys were there. And everyone said, you can't do that. Somebody will kill the fish or drop something in it.
Eat them.
Nothing. Everybody loved the fish tank, but it's the same example. And I think that we often get asked, how do you sell dialogue? And people think that you have to sell dialogue. I just think we have to kind of loosen up some of the way people think about what they can do. I had an experience recently because I've got, as you know, got a bit interested in what's happening in my local community and how to change what's happening in a local, much more kind of place-based thinking about that. So I ended up taking a question to my local council meeting. And you walk in and there's very strict rules about the date it has to be handed in, and you're allowed 3 minutes to read it out and all this stuff. And then you walk in and the leader of the council and the chief exec and the chair are up high on a pedestal, and everybody else is sitting together, all the councillors, like in the House of Commons. And then as a member of the public, I'm put at the end on my own with everybody staring at me and looking down on me with a microphone. Nobody told me what was going to happen. The microphone wasn't even turned on. And I just said to them, when somebody came and turned the microphone on for me, I said, this is really intimidating. I said, I'm not intimidated because I'm confident and this is quite comfortable for me. But if this is the way in which you engage with members of your community, with the public, this is intimidating. Now, that's one thing. I heard one of them from, I think it might have been the chair, say, we know it's intimidating, don't mind. That was the
That's
worst
why
bit.
we do it.
Why are you doing this? Anyway, but so loosening up this, and I know many of the counsellors, and I do think they're decent people, and actually, if I sat down with them, they'd be horrified, but they wouldn't imagine that that's something that they could change.
See a photo in the newspaper of the Prime Minister and Cabinet around a table where they couldn't possibly talk and think together.
I'm finding in this podcast I have the same challenge as you had with the book, which is how do you finish? But my question was going to be to ask you to address our listeners. What would you say to them? What would your advice or guidance be to them?
So my general guidance would be, why not try a bit of dialogue work where you are? I wouldn't start trying to change the world or a multinational organisation or a huge organisation. I'd start where I am, the team I'm working in, the group of people I'm with. From what I've understood, I give it a try and see what happens. And as and when support is needed, I would turn to the academy and say, well, have you got some things could help me? If you feel deeply inside you want to become professional in this field, you may be an engineer or an architect or a solicitor, but you also want to be professional in dialogue work, then of course there's plenty available to do just that. So I would keep in mind the academy, but I'd encourage people to try something and start to... A little bit of dialogue makes a difference. I used to believe it took a lot. You had to be really good to make a start. And then I recall you, Jane, were working with different people and say, well, a day's work can make a surprising difference. Have a try and see.
And so a day turns into 2, and a 2 turns into 3, and so you go.
I did put a final sentence in the book that probably is a short, so they're shorter than the other ones you read. What's the closing sentence there?
The final sentence, my unfolding journey is enriched if yours is more purposeful. The end.
My unfolding journey is enriched if yours is more purposeful. Well, perhaps I'll hear from at some point, but I trust that it has been of assistance and I feel enriched.
Good. Thank you. I'll close the book.
I have one closing request of you.
Okay.
When you publish your book
Yes.
and do a podcast,
Yes.
may I interview you?
Yes.
In that case, I'm happy to close this session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to A New Kind of Dialogue, the podcast, with me, Jane Ball, and Peter Garrett. If you're inspired by any of our thoughts today, visit dialogue-associates.com to find out more. Remember to pick up a copy of A New Kind of Dialogue at Waterstones, on Amazon, or your favourite bookstore. Consider heading back to episode 1 and giving the series another listen. And while you do that, have a think about what you'd like to hear us do with the podcast in the future. We'd love to know what direction you'd like us to go in. Leave a review and give the show a 5-star rating if you've enjoyed it, and subscribe so you don't miss what's next for the show. Check out the show notes for extra information and links. But for now, thank you, and we'll see you next time.